To further discuss the Biden administration, I want to bring in Leslie Sanchez and Joel Payne. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist. Joel is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist, and we enjoy having both of them on. Joel, let me begin with you. New CBS News polling shows the president's approval rating isn't only declining overall, but dropping precipitously among young and independent voters. Tell us, why is this happening now, and how consequential is this to the party?
Well, let's talk about young and independent voters. Young voters are probably looking for some degree of progressive change that they feel like they voted for in November of 2020. And unfortunately, the president has not been able to deliver on that fully. Obviously, lots of good strides with the infrastructure bill and with pushing back on COVID, at least in the beginning of 2021. But voting rights, student loan debt, other issues like that that might matter to those younger voters probably have not. The president is probably not getting a passing grade from them. And then with independents, if the entire premise of the Biden presidency was to bring the country back together and to restore some normalcy, you've still had, as Professor Brown said, some unevenness. And I think that would account for why the president's rating has particularly suffered with those two groups.
Leslie, what do you think is leading to the dissatisfaction among independent voters? And what's the Republican roadmap to win back this group for the midterms?
I think Joel did a really good job of explaining a lot of those progressive ideals that young voters tend to be mercurial about, right? But the biggest one that we heard the most about, campaign promise-wise, was the forgiveness of student debt. And that escalation as it ties into the economy. And you cannot ignore this uptick in inflation. This is a 40-year trend that really, regardless of socioeconomic status or your demographics, your age group, you're continuing to feel the pang of the pain buying basic household goods. That increasingly has a dynamic effect on younger voters. Independent voters, for many reasons, they're watching not only the market, their pocketbook, the economy, but the growing fatigue of the COVID crisis and the kind of lack of understanding that there's a direction forward. You see that move back and forth, but there's a bigger trend here. Since post-World War II, looking at first-term presidents, only Donald Trump was below in terms of underwater, and by about a 1.5 from where the president is right now. Only Bill Clinton matched that. And that isn't just on a few different policy ideas. That is a really turn of the tide. And even a Gallup poll says for the first time since the 1990s, Americans are favoring the Republican Party. So to answer the second part of your question, Republicans are looking at everything from a parent's Bill of Rights. You're seeing the education reform, looking at ensuring that the economy keeps moving, that there's no more mandates of people required to stay home and shutting down any type of business. There's not a tolerance for that. And again, increasingly border security and national security. Those are upticks. So Republicans, I think, are forming, coalescing around the sense of those ideas and really seeing a contrast from where they feel the president is right now.
So, Joel, I want to follow up on what Leslie was saying. With President Biden's priorities stalled in the Senate, at what point does he turn to executive action to get things done? I'm wondering what might be on the list. Leslie was talking about, when it came to young voters and independent voters in particular, that forgiveness of student loan debt. I hope that you might address that specifically.
Yeah, look, that is a real pain point for a lot of young voters. And by the way, not so young voters. I'd like some student loan debt relief as well. Right? I mean, so it's actually an issue that cross-cuts, and it's across party lines. And I think it kind of reflects maybe some generational angst. You've got a lot of young people who have been really just existing from crisis to crisis in adulthood. If you look at someone my age, the first crisis was 9/11. That was my first week in college. And you go on for the following 20 years, there's been nothing but a series of crises, including the one that we're in right now. So you've got that destroying your faith in government, and then you have these niche issues that aren't being met. I do have a broader thought about President Biden, though, Lana, and it's the fact that you have to be the president, right? And there's a little bit of, I think, signaling that the president's got to either stop doing or start doing that's not happening right now. When I see him go up to Capitol Hill, be defeated on something like voting rights, and then go stand at the microphones outside of the Russell Caucus room as if he's the Senate Foreign Relations chair or he's some backbencher from Delaware, that's not who he is. He's the by God president of the United States. Start acting like it. You're not a member of the Senate Democratic Caucus anymore. You're the president.
Lana, if I could jump on that point,
Please.
Joe brings up a really interesting thing, and there's a historical precedence for that. So the style of the president's campaign, right? There was so much criticism that the president was basically running from his basement. Very few public events, didn't have the big rallies. You could argue, oh, we were in the pandemic. Trump kept going and having these super spreader events. But in contrast, Biden spent a tremendous amount of campaign time alone with a very tight group of people. And then he becomes president, in many reasons through faults of the former president. And now we expect him to be on this large stage, kind of a really strong, commanding appeal. And that's not what he's done. That's not the type of leader he's shown to be just recently in running for president this time around, where he was successful. So I think there's a lot of expectation that he was going to come out and have these broad changes and bring this strong tone of leadership together that would unite people, especially as we see increasing tensions abroad. And that deficit, that void, is increasing the anxiety. So I think we could have said we predicted that. Why would he be different from the campaign? But Joel's point is very relevant with respect to how this looks and what we expect.
So, Joel, I want to ask you, because now there are two issues that you and Leslie have identified. One is these legislative defeats, and then the other is that presidential essence, I guess, and in particular that press conference that he had, where then the White House had to clarify a lot of the remarks and walk back some of the things that he was saying or appeared to be saying. So when we're talking about President Biden earlier this week saying that his big grandiose plan for his social and climate spending bill, that's now going to need to be broken up into smaller pieces, is there actually a path to get any legislative wins on the book, even if you're breaking it up into smaller pieces? Or is there something else that he should pivot and try and be doing from the perspective of a Democratic strategist?
I think there is a path. Look, some of those items in Build Back Better, while some Republicans may not like the entire package, there are going to be things that are going to be palatable to some of those Republicans, even if they disagree with the president broadly. Mitt Romney has talked about agreeing with kind of some of the parts of the agenda, but again, not wanting to pass it as a package. You could probably get a Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins to come on board, and there's probably a half dozen or so Republicans who at least would be more willing to have a conversation about some parts of the Build Back Better agenda. It'll be called something different. It'll be broken up into smaller pieces. But Lana, to your point and to what Leslie and I were saying about, I like how you say presidential essence. You have to carry yourself as if you are the leader of the Democratic Party and the leader of the country. And it's, to me, as a Democrat, it's troubling when you have Joe Manchin in the middle of the president's press conference going and deciding to go on the Senate floor in an outright rebuke of the president. That is disrespect. When Kristen Sinema did it last week when President Biden was on Capitol Hill trying to get the voting rights package passed. That's disrespect. When Joe Manchin did that with another news program a couple Sundays ago, that is disrespect that suggests he does not have command of his party. And I think that is, for me as a Democrat, that's troubling. I know President Biden can get back there, but that is, I don't know if that's symptom or if that is the disease itself that is ailing this presidency right now.
All right, only with a quick second left, Leslie Sanchez, want to ask you very quickly, given the way that things are going, given this conversation, as a Republican strategist, do you think that Republicans ought to be laying out legislative priorities of their own or just sitting back?
Republicans are taking an aggressive approach. They're feeling optimistic, cautiously optimistic. And I think you're going to start hearing more about their new, quote unquote, contract with America, what they would do in leadership.
All right, Leslie Sanchez, Joel Payne, thank you both.